So unless anybody indicates otherwise, I'm going to go through the list of issues as they're laid out in the agenda. Does anybody need to leave early that wants us to talk about a specific issue, and we can, you know, happily rearrange it? Does it matter? Okay.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. I'm John Verre. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Special Education and Student Services in the Boston Public Schools, and in my role, I've been working closely with the leadership of this group, Carolyn and John, at this point, to try to find meaningful ways that we can get better at meeting your expectations. And so I look forward to coming here once a month and hearing from you, and also sharing information with you about things that are going on and things that are going to be coming up in special education for the Boston Public Schools.
And just so everybody understands, we meet frequently with BPS, we go to the school committee meetings, and then we meet with them on specific issues. So this is really an opportunity to bring back to the membership what's been going on, to give people updates with regard, and I know there's a new student assignment process. I'm also on the External Advisory Committee that was charged with creating a new assignment model for the district. And obviously my focus was primarily in special education, although I was a member with regard to the whole assignment model. So since that was just approved on Monday and it was presented to the school committee last night, I just wanted to update you on where that stands too. But the first issue on the agenda this evening is the Harbor Middle School and High School, which is also related to the Henderson pathway. Those issues go together. The Henderson School is K0 to 5th grade, and there's been a plan for a number of years to create an inclusion pathway to the middle school and then the high school for the children that have been at the Henderson School and that have been in full inclusion. So through advocacy of SpedPac, through the Office of Special Education, and specifically Diane Lashinskis, who has a child at the Harbor School, we were first able to advocate for and obtain the middle school pathway and make sure that inclusion existed in those classes for children that were educated at the Henderson School, where there's a co-taught model with a general education teacher and a special education teacher in each classroom. But the Harbor also serves other children that are coming in from other schools because it's a middle school and has a larger population. There was also a push this year to get the high school further expanded. Last January they agreed to do a 9th grade, which started in September, and now that's going to progress to a high school as well. Since we last met, there's been 2 new leaders appointed to the Harbor School. The new middle school principal is Nadia Cyprian, and the high school principal is Isabella DePina. So the district has designated someone specifically to handle the high school portion of that program, which had yet to have a leader until recently. So, John, I don't know if you want to give any specific updates on that.
I just add a couple of things. I just came, before coming to this meeting, from a support group meeting at the Harbor, attended by both principals of the Harbor schools, Harbor Middle, Harbor High, and also the principal from the Henderson. And there also were the new assistant superintendents who have been appointed as supervisors of principals. And so the new assistant superintendent for the Harbor Middle School and the new person for the high school were both there. I was really encouraged by this meeting for the amount we got done in an hour and a half and the commitments that we made to the schools that will start happening tomorrow. So some of you know, because we worked together on this, that I've been working with parents and school people at the Harbor for the last couple of years, and I'm struck by how different this meeting felt from other meetings we've had, because there were decision makers there and people who could actually get things done. So I think we're looking at a whole lot of work yet to be done, but that work is being put on a short timeline. I think that over the course of the next few months before the end of the year, we're going to see some qualitative change at the middle school and some real development at the high school. So we're looking forward to what we're doing. Yeah, I think.
Okay, so with regard to the Henderson Harbor Pathway, there's been two groups appointed. One is a working group and one is the steering group. So the working group is going to be comprised of principals from inclusion schools, the Henderson and the Mary Lyon School. There will also be two regular education teachers on there to try to help the general education side of the equation really understand inclusion at a much more in-depth level. And then there's also going to be a steering committee that's above the working group that will consist of outside consultants, you know, John Verre, Eileen Nash, who's the
Deputy Superintendent.
Deputy Superintendent of Individualized Learning. There'll be Drew Eckelman, who's the new person above that particular cluster, or they're now calling them networks. BPS has restructured the whole district overall. We used to have a system of clusters, and then that was disbanded, but now people are being separated into networks. So there's direct reporting lines up from the schools to supervisors and then up to network superintendents. So this is sort of in coordination with that, in trying to make sure that the right people are in the right positions. I will say that the steering group and the working group for the Henderson Harbor Pathway is something that was much needed, because the amount of attention and work that needed to go in and making the pathway something truly successful had not existed previously, and it was something that parents were pushing really hard for. But I don't want people to think that that's the only inclusion issue that's being worked on throughout the district. Inclusion is every child's right under the law, which is to be educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent appropriate. And in BPS right now, 46% of children with disabilities are educated in a substantially separate setting. So it's been a focus and priority of ours to increase inclusion opportunities throughout the district. This is one particular example of trying to create a seamless pathway from K0 to 12, because a lot of children that had gone to the Henderson School and had been in inclusion throughout their elementary years did not have somewhere to go in middle school and then even into high school. So this has been sort of a process that's folded out over the years because of a lot of work by parents, and you know, it's just sort of one example of where particular focus is now being brought in to make the situation a reality and to make that pathway truly meaningful. So the pathway itself is something that has a particular focus, and we wanted to update that because some parents from the Henderson who have children in the 5th grade are very concerned about them moving on to the middle school and what's going on at the middle school, and there now is new leadership there, and we just wanted to update people that the work has actually begun with regard to that pathway. So that's really an update on that. I don't know if Diane, you want to add anything?
No.
Okay. You want anything? Okay. So with regard to inclusion overall, there's been a number of meetings before the school committee where parents have come and testified about the importance of inclusion. Again, it's supposed to be the norm rather than the exception, and we've been pushing for more inclusion schools throughout BPS. BPS does have more inclusion schools that offer inclusive opportunities, but that's something different from what we traditionally understand as a full inclusion school, which we've traditionally known as the Mary Lyon or the Henderson School, that offers inclusion in every class throughout the program. So currently we have, how many?
26.
26 schools that offer inclusive opportunities, and we're working to obviously expand inclusion opportunities throughout all of those different schools. But the issue has really been, what is the long-term plan and how do we bring focus to that? As part of the role that I played on the External Advisory Committee, having to do with developing a new assignment model and the special education students, how will they be served? The district has committed to doing a plan by June of this year that will be submitted to the school committee for its approval, in collaboration working with SpedPac and other school leaders, to develop a 3 to 5 year plan with specific targets for inclusion and increasing inclusion throughout the district. So when we talk about the assignment model later on in this meeting. I just want people to understand that this inclusion is something that we want targeted and expanded throughout the district, in all neighborhoods, in every community, and we don't want it to just exist the way that it has, which has been in very few schools throughout the district. So it's a work in progress, but I think that we've made substantial progress, and especially in getting a commitment to have a strategic plan developed by June of this year. We also got a commitment that the district will create and open, not new schools, but 2 new full inclusion schools by September of 2013. So that's right after this summer. 2 schools are going to be identified this year to be full inclusion for the next school year. So in addition to the Mary Lyon and the Henderson, and I know that the Mason is inclusion, and also I think the Holmes, 2 other schools are going to be identified to expand inclusion opportunities throughout the district. They haven't been identified in terms of their geographic location yet, so I can't share that information with you. But obviously that's good news to know that we're moving forward to increasing those opportunities. Does anyone have any questions yet?
This one is out of curiosity. The possible fit of where the high school is going to be at?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear your
Where is
question.
the high school going to be? The high school, the possible.
Right now, what we've talked about is the expansion of the Harbor School from middle to high school. Whether or not one of the 2 new and full inclusion schools is going to be a high school has not been communicated to us yet. I think that that's something that's under consideration.
Let's try to repeat the question.
Yeah, so sorry. But I didn't fully understand. You said 46%. So if the child has an IEP and they're not in a inclusion school, does that mean they have to leave the school? Or what does that mean if it's not inclusion?
The process is that every child's team comes together to develop their IEP. The information is generated through, if it's an annual, through their yearly progress reports and sort of how the child is doing, or if it's a new IEP or 3-year re-eval based on the evaluations that are there. So the team will decide what the child's services are, and after they develop the IEP itself, then they decide the type of placement that the child needs, whether it's full inclusion, partial inclusion, or substantially separate. And then the team decides, for children who are in full inclusion and partial inclusion, there's specific opportunities for that. And then if a child's in a substantially separate setting, because that's the type of setting that they require according to the team, then they're placed in a substantially separate classroom. And now we have highly specialized strands to provide the continuity for substantially separate classrooms the way it is for inclusion, for grade to grade in the same building. But the children who have partial inclusion, for a lot of those children, they're in inclusion during the day, and then they get pulled out for different services during the day, and they're supposed to be able to be educated in any school throughout the district because the services come to the child as opposed to the child going to the services. What we're talking about is that with regard to full inclusion, inclusion doesn't have to look like the same thing all the time. It can have many different models and forms. It does in different districts and in different states throughout the country. But what I'm saying is in Boston, what we've known, as parents living with full inclusion, that has meant to us sort of the limited schools like the Mary Lyon and the Henderson who have classes that in every class there are children with special needs being serviced in the inclusion setting. So that's something different from whether or not there's a few children here and there in a school that might be on an IEP. We're talking about it's in every grade in every classroom. So there are other models throughout the school district that service children in inclusive settings. But what we're talking about is sort of a whole program that goes for continuity from grade to grade. So the issue is really we're trying to increase those opportunities. But even still, all of the children that are in full inclusion and all of the children are in partial inclusion, that's 54% of our children. There's 46% of children in BPS that have special needs that are being served in substantially separate settings, meaning that they're not educated with their non-disabled peers.
And that's too high.
That's really high.
Yeah.
It's really high.
So,
10,600 students in all special ed schools with 100% special ed.
No, all special education programs. Most of those programs are located in general education settings, but they're separate programs. And we've known for a while that that's too high. When I got here 3 years ago, it was 54%, and so it's come steadily down, but that's very gradual. And thanks to the activity of the SpedPac and in some individual parents, we're now planning to escalate that change. I have to say that for the last year or so, we've been talking about inclusion as it should be the preference for placement. And as a result, many families have approached me to pursue inclusive placements for their children, and we've made those placements. So there's a change going on at the district level. There's a change going on where the district now, thanks to this group, the SpedPac, there's a change going on at the district level where we're focusing on the development of more inclusive programs. There's a change going on at many schools. Carolyn mentioned 26 schools in the Inclusive Schools Network. That's a change that's going on in the programs and services in schools. There's also a change going on at the individual family and child level, where parents are demanding more inclusion. That's a very important thing. So as I said last month and the month before, if you are going through the evaluation process, either as an annual review or a 3-year reevaluation, or an original evaluation, or an unscheduled evaluation, any of those issues, together with you, we should be considering more inclusive programming for your child. And when parents demand more inclusion, we make it happen. And I'm part of that process. So a number of you have come to actually sit down individually with me to talk about your individual children and the way in which we are serving them. And I encourage you to do that.
And I think part of letting you know that these inclusive opportunities are being expanded and exist out there is so that when parents do go to their IEP meetings, if they want their child in inclusion, is for you to know, if you're told that it's not available, that that's just not true, and that you need to push back and say, no, inclusion is something that my child is entitled to by law, if it's appropriate for them, and my child can benefit. And some children might not benefit from the whole day in inclusion, but they might, you know, even if it's a child that needs to be in substantially separate or pull out for academics, they could still benefit from being in inclusion for specials like art and music and things like that, because socialization is part of your special education services too. So you really want to look at how can my child be included, when should my child be included, and is that opportunity being offered to my child?
What do I do in the case of a school that doesn't accept my child because she takes the alternate MCAS assessment? Because the Mary Lyons is considered a full inclusion school, but then my child can't go there in 2 years because she takes the alternate MCAS.
I think you...
So I have only one option, and that's not fair for parents to only have one option right now, because the Harbor is not doing a stellar job right now, and you're relying on us to trust that it's going to get better.
Right.
And I'm hoping it will get better. But in a year from now, I'm going to be sitting here, and if the Harbor's not better, what do I do with a child who can't go to the Mary Lyons?
So we shouldn't wait for a year. You should schedule a time to come in and sit down and talk with me so that we can begin that process.
Right, but I'm not the only one. There's about, a third of the parents in my child's school that are going to have this problem. So that Henderson has a lot of parents. I'm representing them, saying that not just for myself, but parents this year. Because parents this year have to decide on a school, and the Harbor's not a choice, and now they're panicking. And so I'm wondering, when I go back to them and they say, hey, what'd you get for an answer, and what can we do with our kid who can't go to the Mary Lyons because they take an alternate MCAS, and I can't pay $30,000 a year for tuition at a private school, what do we do?
I think we ought to sit down together.
Okay.
Patricia Lampron, your principal, was at the meeting I just came from, and she talked about this same issue. I think it might be good for me and for all of us if we sat down together and talked about what the other opportunities that we know are going to exist in September, and the other ones that we estimate will exist a year later in September. And Harbor Middle will be one of those, but it will be only one of those. So I think we need to talk about those things as early as we can.
And I would say too is that with 2 new full inclusion schools scheduled to occur in September of 2013, that those should also potentially be options. I don't know specifically what grades they're going to be or what their locations are.
Be the K through
But
6
yeah,
or K through 5.
but I will say this, there's supposed to be a strategic plan developed, and I've already been asked to be at those meetings, to develop an inclusion plan to submit to the school committee by June. I mean, the parent volunteers, myself and John and other people that have asked to sign up to be on the inclusion task force are being invited to participate in that. So, obviously we're bringing back the parents' concerns about the full inclusion and opportunities for inclusion, and we're just sort of updating you on where we're certainly by no means done with this. It's going to be, a many-year process, but we're at least bringing people up to speed on what's happened since, since we've been working on it this year.
Yes.
I would use the system, so what is inclusion?
Inclusion means that a child with a disability and that's eligible for an IEP, that has an IEP, that means that their team has determined that it's appropriate for them to be educated in the same classroom as their non-disabled peers. So basically in the general education classroom, inclusion means you're in with non-disabled peers, but you're also getting your individual needs your needs that result from your disabilities. So it means that you're in a regular classroom. Substantially separate means that it's a classroom that only has children that are on IEPs, and there's no children from the general education classroom in there.
I think that's what we are.
Substantially separate.
I think so these guys only 8 and they all there.
I think as a matter of perspective in this district, there's been a long-standing preference for separation, and we're trying to turn that around to a new commitment or preference for inclusion. That doesn't happen by somebody making a rule. It happens by people changing their minds and hearts, and our changing the programs that are available in schools. And parents expecting, even demanding, inclusive placements. That's one of the mechanisms that seems to be helping move this forward more quickly, is the expectations of parents.
I have a child in general education, and they are in a separate class, and I'm all for the inclusion, but I was just wondering, when you do start the new inclusion, whatever, are the teachers or the parent teachers or whatever going to have some kind of special education training, or are they just going to be general education teachers? Because
What the model looks like, it has not been determined, but I would say is if the children are in there and they require specialized services in the classroom, they could either be with a teacher that's dual certified, that has both a regular license and then a special education certification. It could be a 2-teacher model like it is at the Henderson with 1 regular ed and 1 special education teacher in the classroom. It could be a combination of the special education teacher coming in for certain portions of the day. So it's not really a set model. It depends on sort of what's needed and what the population requires. It's really driven by the IEPs of the children. But whether or not, obviously we want more inclusion because our percentage is very high. It's much higher than anywhere else in the state or even in the country. So we're pushing for more inclusion because it's just not logical that 46% of our children require a substantially separate setting in order to receive the services they need. Having said that, there will always remain a portion of the population that may need that, so that will continue to be offered as an option for children who require it. You know, it's not taking away one and replacing it with the other. It's having the full complement of options. What we're saying is full inclusion has not been an option for many children in the district, and there was a historical practice of placing way too many children in substantially separate. And what we're saying is we need to revisit that, because children need to be educated with their non-disabled peers, not just for learning academics, but for developing life skills in terms of socialization and emotional issues and learning how to function in society. So what we're really doing is pushing the district to change that 46%, but we're not talking about it would go away completely.
I'm just concerned because, I mean, I don't want my child to be in a classroom where the teacher isn't, you know, equipped to handle a special ed child, and then everyone suffers.
Sure.
Right.
Well, we don't want that either. I mean, we are obligated and committed to the successful educational experience for every child with disabilities. And there's evidence that when children with disabilities are well taught in inclusive settings, they do much better in the long run, many of them, many students. But they have to be well taught. And we started a much more comprehensive program of professional development a year ago. 1,000 special ed and regular ed teachers have participated in the professional development that we've offered over the last year, that we will continue to offer that and try to capture everyone. We're also going to be repurposing a lot of our special education staff going into the future. So we have many, many very good teachers teaching in separate classrooms right now, and if they were paired with general education teachers or those who are dually certified, maybe teaching in classrooms where they have both children with disabilities and children without. Those are great teachers who are now teaching in separate classrooms, and we're going to move in another direction over the next few years.
But I think in response to your question is that if your child were to go into a full inclusion classroom, and depending on the model that the classroom may be, the team decides how that would be appropriate for your child and what supports and services that your child requires in order to be successful in that environment. And that may mean additional paraprofessional support. Obviously with regard to sort of specialized services, the person has to be certified in that area, so it couldn't be a general education teacher providing special education services. So that's the way that things get worked out. But I don't want people to think that there's only one particular model of inclusion that works. There's many different models that work, and it really depends on which children are being serviced in which programs, what that model should look like.
Yeah, John, I have two questions. The first one, given what Carolyn was just saying about different approaches or styles for different populations, what is the school district doing to sort of develop standards for or criteria for establishing inclusion programs that are done successfully and done well, as opposed to programs that are inclusion in name only? Okay, that's the first question. The second question is the school district open to possibility of at least some K through 5 schools that are, seem to be showing success in the inclusion network, expanding them to K through 8? That's the second question.
Okay, so let me speak to the first one first. We have been very fortunate to have the support for the last 2 years of the Education Development Center and a group of experts in the area of inclusion from other parts of the country. And we now, for the 26 schools in the Inclusive Schools Network, a small team of consultants are available to those schools to come in regularly, advise leadership and teachers, and provide professional development in the schools. What's clear to us is that the approaches, I hesitate to call them models, because I think that models are approaches that have been evaluated, objectively and proven to be effective, and not very much in the field of inclusion rise to the level of models. But there are many effective approaches that have been used all over the country that we are now considering here, and some of it is being implemented here under very good advice from people who know what they're doing. We've identified 5 different approaches to things like class size, class composition, and staffing in the Boston Public Schools, operating in different places, and we're looking at those things critically. I think, and this is on the advice of people advising me, that the approach that we're using ought to be tailored to who the children are, rather than, what do I like and what do you like, or what makes me feel comfortable and what makes you feel comfortable. It ought to be what's calculated to result in the best outcomes for kids. And that's a very high standard, and one that we are trying to move toward. That's kind of in answer to your first question. On the second question, the district is now considering moving to more K-8 schools, and at the same time considering having more inclusive schools. Your point, I think, is really well taken, that we made a commitment a few years ago to continuity for children with disabilities, so that your child wouldn't have to go to one school for a couple of years and switch, go to another school, switch, go to another school. We moved away from that pretty successfully, especially at the K-8 level. And we're moving next year into the high schools with that. We're going to do the same thing for inclusion. So as Carolyn will be talking in a few minutes about the new assignment plan and the what's called the special education overlay, which identifies 7 special education program clusters in the city. And within each one of those geographic areas, we are charged with developing the full range of opportunities for kids with disabilities. So in my neighborhood, it's a cluster that extends across North Dorchester and South Boston. We will be developing a full range of strands, substantially separate strands for high incidence populations, and we'll be developing K-8 inclusive opportunities in that geographic area. That's going to take us a couple of years. Here, and then Jerry, and then back there. Yeah.
I just would like to ask, where do private schools stand in this? Are they going to elect on their own?
The question was, where do pilot schools stand in this?
All of the schools of the city, all of the various types of schools, I think we call them traditional schools, pilot schools, turnaround schools, innovation schools, and horseman charter schools. I think those are the different kinds of public schools there are. They're all in the networks. And now, pilot school, each of those different categories operate a little bit differently, but they're all part of the same network. Jerry?
Yeah, I guess what I get confused about around inclusion is that there seems to be 2 different definitions of inclusion in the same word. One is a school that is very intentionally, almost therapeutically inclusion, where you have lower class size, you have, as you described, 1 or 2 teachers who are certified. It could be a whole school, like the Verre or the Henderson, or it could be a program within a school. But then you have this notion of the goal of all schools in the city being inclusive options for our kids wherever they live, wherever they go, which would mean that in any given school where you have a class size of 126, 127, there's this notion that it's going to be inclusive. Otherwise, it suggests that every school is going to have a lower class size. So that's what I find it confusing. that on the one hand, you have 3,000 kids, so in quote-unquote inclusion, but then you only have a much lower number of kids who are classified in the inclusion therapeutic setting. So maybe that needs to be.
That's an interesting union of words, therapeutic inclusion setting. I think I understand what you're talking about there.
No, I didn't make it up. I've heard that from.
Okay, oh, it's good. I have something to say, but did you want to say something about that?
Well, I was just going to say that inclusion is really, it's not, it doesn't look like a particular thing. It's really a child's experience, and depending on the child's needs, it can look very differently from child to child. I think what we're talking about here is the different types of inclusion programs that have been known in BPS historically to parents of children with special needs, but also the fact that children that have less severe disabilities that could be serviced in any school throughout the city by bringing the services to the child, that child's participation in inclusion is not in any way diminished because it's still appropriate for that individual child. So I think what we're talking about is programs being inclusion from beginning to end versus schools having inclusion opportunities or having children who require an inclusion placement be serviced in those schools. I mean, that's the distinct difference that we've seen. And for children that have the inclusion sort of as the continuum of services from grade to grade, I mean, I think we all know that the Henderson School serves children who have significant disabilities, and the Mary Lyons has traditionally served children with emotional disabilities and some children on the autism spectrum. But, you know, there's obviously many more of those children throughout BPS, and what we're trying to do is give those children the same opportunity as the children that currently are enrolled in those schools.
Just to follow that with one point. I don't think I could have said it any better or more clearly. I would add that the Massachusetts regulations, special education regulations, define what full inclusion is, what partial inclusion is, and what substantially separate is. I'm obligated to make sure that those options are available for children in the Boston Public Schools. And thinking of inclusion that way, we have far too many kids where their teams recommend that they be separated from their typically developing peers. The other way is the way that Carolyn and John and other parent leaders have talked about it, which is remembering that inclusion is about, as Carolyn just said, it's about the individual child. And it means at its essence that a child is educated with their non-disabled peers. And believe me, when I came here 3 years ago, I went to a SpedPac executive board meeting, and one of the members of the board said, well, how many inclusive schools do you think we need? And I said 130. So all schools should be offering inclusive set of placements for kids. That's different from a school that we call here an inclusion school, where all the children are in full inclusion in that school. So I think it's been a gift for me in my role to work with a group of parents who are pursuing this with me. And I don't think this is simple at all. I think it's complicated. And I think if we can keep in mind that we're talking about your individual child, and what your individual child needs, and making sure that we've got settings of many different kinds to meet the many different needs of your children. There was a question back there and then one here. Okay. Yeah, in the very back, and then the other gentleman there, the gentleman.
What we lose in the gap, then making the job so easy, like the test, the work for school, so taking catch up with the attitudes, what music they use, instead of keeping them at the same level, giving them music stuff, it's the work to do.
Well, That's a more complicated question because, you know, first of all, it depends on, every child has their own individual potential, meaning what that child can be expected to do. And then you look at, based on that child's individual potential, we want to challenge that child and we want them to reach their individual potential, whatever that may be. And I think that if you're saying that, you know, whether or not it's possible to close the gap for any one individual child, it really depends on who that child is and what their disabilities are and how those disabilities impact that individual child. I mean, I know myself, my daughter is significantly handicapped, and she's never going to be able to close that gap completely, but she's going to be able to make gains at her own pace and move forward in her own developmental progress and make, you know, progress in her own way. So I don't really know if I can answer sort of if your child's being challenged or not. That would depend on what the evaluations say and what services that your child's receiving. But if you have a concern about that, then that's something to talk about to us separately and sort of identify for that issue so that we can investigate that further on your behalf. But every child is different, so, you know, and obviously specialized services are meant to remediate and to make progress in the areas that are impacted by the disability. And the goal is to close that gap as much as possible for each individual child so that they can you know, progress effectively in whatever their own trajectory is, but whether or not that's going to be at grade level depends on the child. And sort of, you can make more progress in one year than another, or there will be children that make slower progress and don't actually get up to their grade level or age level peers, but they're making their own progress in their own time, and they need those specialized services in order to make the progress that they're making.
Just out of curiosity, for the middle school, what, as a down the line, what is going to happen to those middle schools, the traditional middle schools?
So what I...
Because you can't, I'm sorry, you can't fit all the students in a certain neighborhood or whatever their levels are for according to the IEP into just one K through 8 in that neighborhood.
This is actually part of the new assignment process because parents of kids in K to 5 schools are very concerned about sort of predictability when it comes to the middle school, and that's why 60% of parents, when they pick a school to begin with, they choose a K to 8 school so they know what that predictability is where their child's going to be for those years. For the parents who are in the K through 5 schools, the district has identified for each elementary school what the middle school feeder pathway is going to be. That means that parents will have that predictability of knowing where it is that their child can go to school, but parents can also decline going to that feeder middle school and choose from one of the other middle schools. But it was really a way to provide predictability that didn't exist previously, with people choosing from a whole range of middle schools and not knowing if your child was going to get in or how it was going to work. So that's part of, there are assignment meetings in the next 2 weeks, and I would encourage people to go to them if they want to learn more specific information about the whole assignment process. But there is a middle school overlay on bostonschoolchoice.org. They also have all of the maps laid out for people to look at. What I was going to go over this evening is the component that relates specifically to special education. What you need to understand is that there was a new model chosen for regular education students, and then for children who are ELL, English language learners, they have an overlay, meaning that that works separate and distinct from the new model. And then for children with special needs, there's an overlay for us that works separate and distinct from the Model A that was recommended to the school committee. And then there's the middle school overlay, which basically provides everybody with what the middle school predictable school will be depending on where their child goes to school. So for the special education overlay, it's broken up into 7 clusters, but it's actually 6 because 2 of them are combined. Go ahead.
There were a couple of parents who may have had the last couple of questions about inclusion before we go on to the assignment model.
Yeah, we're not cutting off one subject
and
moving on to the other. We'll come back to those. But if no, I think I should give sort of an update on where it is. The special education overlay, so it's basically divided up into 6 clusters. It's A through G, but F and G are combined. And what it does is it tries to separate the city into specific clusters based on geographic location in a way that evenly distributes the special education population in a way that is commensurate with the overall population in BPS. So basically it's trying to, make an equitable distribution of all students with disabilities. Within each one of the clusters, the district is going to provide options with regard to, for children with moderate to high needs. They'll have the type of placement determined by their team within their cluster. What this really means is that they're going to be bringing the services to the children and not the children to the services. So, excuse me, your child would be able to go closer to home, ideally, because it would be within their cluster, which is based on where you live. So the clusters are drawn up based on where students live, and within each cluster there'll be a range of all of the types of placements that are required for children with special needs, from full inclusion to partial inclusion to substantially separate. Sorry. The only thing I would add is that for children that have low incidence disabilities who currently go to schools that are considered citywide because there's not as high of a population of children with those particular disabilities, those programs will continue to be citywide because they serve a specific number in a population. So with regard to the SpEd overlay, it was presented, and I helped present this to the school committee last night. It's really just a map that provides the foundation to then develop the programming that's needed for the children that reside throughout the city of Boston. But what I did is, as part of the External Advisory Committee, was to include in the recommendations to the school committee that the approval of the SpEd overlay by the External Advisory Committee is contingent upon the full implementation of BPS's stated commitment to expand inclusion in BPS, including establishing a minimum of 2 new full inclusion schools for the 2013 to 2014 school year, developing a comprehensive work plan for submission to the school committee by June 2013 on how BPS will continue to expand inclusion for the next 3 to 5 years, with set targets through close collaboration with Boston SpedPac and schools, issuing new guidelines for placement, clarifying substantially separate as the exception versus the norm, training special education coordinators on guidelines, inclusion, and new inclusion programs by spring and summer of this year, building accountability systems to monitor the percentage of students with disabilities recommended for inclusion by coordinators and IEP teams, and targeting clusters in the SpEd overlay with fewer inclusion options for new programming in the fall of 2014. The SpEd overlay of geographic clusters provides a foundation to implement all of the above necessary actions in BPS, to expand inclusion for students with disabilities, and to change its long-standing practices of segregating students with disabilities. BPS needs to capitalize on its institutional knowledge present at the Henderson and Mary Lyons schools and replicate those successes from K0 through 12th grade, and significantly decrease the percentage of students with disabilities currently being served in segregated settings. All clusters need to provide the types of programs and settings that are necessary to meet each child's individual needs as close to home as possible, and provide students with disabilities with the free and appropriate public education that is required under special education laws and regulations. So that is what I wrote to go along with those clusters, because it really is just a map, and it's the commitment that we've been given regarding what the district is going to do to increase inclusion that has the most meaning. And so the approval of that map is contingent upon the implementation of those commitments. Did someone have a question?
So there was a question here and then a couple here. So.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of, so there's two parts. We're in the West Zone, and as far as we can see from all our research, and our daughter is in kindergarten at the Haley. We really love the Haley. I feel like they're following the model of the Henderson, going along. It's a K through 5 school. As far as we can see, it's like middle school is not an option in the West Zone unless we move somewhere, because for our vision for our daughter is to remain fully included, and we just don't see that, if that opportunity does not currently exist, and so are we looking at kind of the equity of creating these opportunities across zones? Because I do know, you're naming some schools that have that, but just kind of looking for those kids in the West Zone, it doesn't exist right now. And then secondly, in terms of inclusion and the vision for those 26 schools that you currently have within the network, what I experienced in kind of looking at the West Zone is some schools had inclusion, but it was for a homogeneous group, a disability group. And that, in my mind, doesn't look like inclusion because it's kind of, it's for that group, they're being included, but the diversity of what we're, the ultimate vision of inclusion, and don't get me wrong, I'm a special educator, I totally know this is really difficult, but I guess I'm thinking it's like, when we're looking forward, you're making all these changes, are we still tracking like same groups to go to same schools? Like this will be the group for including the kids with this disability. This will be the school to include.
No, I would certainly expect that not to be the case because obviously that's not desirable and that's not the way the world looks. So we want the programs to look like the world. Having said that, there will be some disabilities that require more specialized services that may make it appropriate for schools to service a particular population. So I guess what I'm saying is that sort of this 3 to 5 year plan with targets should be a look at what do we have and what do we need? And where do we have it and where do we need it? So that obviously, it's a terrible disservice to a child to allow them to, for them to go to inclusion and then have that inclusion pathway just come to a screeching halt and all of a sudden the only option that's left is for them to go into substantially separate. So that's what we're looking to change, is to create that opportunity for more children throughout BPS and then to obviously make that opportunity meaningful throughout the educational life of that child. So that's something in terms of looking at the big picture overall. And I just don't want people, see, it's, my entire time in BPS, the only real inclusion models I've known myself are the Mary Lyon and the Henderson. So we use those as examples because they're the most commonly known, but they're certainly not the only types of programs that can and should exist. But it's almost like, but if we do know what works, shouldn't we be replicating what does work rather than trying to start from scratch, at least in some circumstances.
Absolutely. And they're great models.
Yes.
Yeah, I would add, neither the Henderson nor the Lyon is appropriate to serve all kinds of kids. And so we need diversity in our population of schools. I would also say that when we set up our highly specialized strands 2 years ago, these are the substantially separate programs, and started talking with schools about more inclusion but higher levels of specialization for certain populations of kids. We've said right from the beginning we wanted to move away from disability groups. We wanted to move toward portfolios of service. So an example of that is the Mary Lyon, which is now serving kids certain students who have emotional impairment and certain students who have autism, but not the entire population of either one of those groups. So it's about what's the capacity, the capability of the school or the program. I would like to move away from having highly specialized strands which are named by disability groups. I'd rather have them named by the portfolio of services that they offer. That's pretty sophisticated and pretty demanding. And if we stay together long enough, we'll do it. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of very careful thought and planning. There was a question here. Yeah.
I just want to know the timeline. When will clusters know when these new schools are in? Is it September 2013? Is that like?
Well, actually what it is that the whole assignment plan that was proposed and recommended does not go into effect until a year from September. But I was able to get them to commit to give us 2 new inclusion schools by this fall coming, because it's been a really big push for us to get inclusion increased. And also this strategic plan that's going to be developed between now and June should really give us much more concrete information on where things are going to happen, how they're going to happen, and sort of taking that big look at things,
So the strategic plan, when we know about what's in that strategic plan?
in June, by the end of this school year.
So they just on BPS website?
Well, we'll obviously get copies and we'll put it out on our website and send it out to our email. So if anybody hasn't signed up for our email, I would encourage you to do so. But then also at bostonspedpac.org, John posts all of those things.
We'll do our best to keep everybody posted. I just want to take a quick break real quick and give Carolyn a break with her voice. There's a couple of things. One is general issue forms. If you need to write up an issue that you want us to submit to John Verre and his department, there are forms right up here in English and Spanish. There's also transportation forms if needed. You feel free to fill that out. We will get those to John Verre directly, and then he can find the right people to work on those issues for you. If you have a problem or an issue, come up and get a form, and you can fill that out and hand it in tonight, okay? There was a couple issues regarding the Improving School Choice hearings discussed this evening. I just want to bring up Thursday, March 7th at 6 p.m. here will be one of the hearings in the longer format. On March 13th at the Court Street Chambers, there'll be a 1 hour smaller version. So if you do want to hear more about Improving School Choice, the SpEd overlay, things like that, the best meeting to come to might be the 6 p.m. meeting on March 7th, and that would be right here. Okay? Let's see. One little minor note, I'm working with Transportation. Carl Allen, who's the new head of Transportation, on starting to roll out the application that allows you to track your bus. It's called Where's My Bus? And it will allow you, as a parent, to be able to know where your bus is at any given point. If it's delayed, you can track it through GPS, and it shows on a map where the bus is to your locale. You also can see if it's already missed you and moved on. It's a little slow in the rollout, and I tell you this because I don't want everybody to jump at it, but our goal as an organization is because of our kids' needs and the anxieties our kids have with the bus being late, not showing up. This is a really critical app. We're going to work with Carl Allen to make sure that the SpEd parents get a preferred placement to those apps so you guys can have it. Works on a phone, works on iPad, works on a computer as well, so it's website driven. So it gives a lot of peace of mind. It's not great, but it's enough that you can know kind of where the bus is. So that's it for me at this point.
I just wanted to mention a couple of things, then we'll go on and take more questions. There are two people in the room that have been here every month, and I just want to make sure you know they're here. Back in that corner in the green sweater is Maggie Druneau, who is our manager of operations. So she's the person in our department who does an awful lot of the problem solving around transportation and school facilities. So if you fill out a form or call the office about a transportation problem, it's very likely that Maggie's going to be working on that at some point. Also here tonight, as every month, is Natalie Ake in the purple bluish sweater. Natalie is one of the supervisors of special education for the city, and she is our specialist on family engagement. And so if you're not sure how to follow up on a problem, or if you've got questions you want to ask, contacting Natalie is a really good idea, because part of her, she's also one of our supervisors in the schools, so she has a whole group of schools that she works with, but she's our specialist on family engagement. So if you've got particular issues that you want to talk to another, Natalie is the parent of a child with disabilities in the Boston Public Schools and an experienced coordinator of special ed in one of our very large schools. So if you want to talk to another parent about the issues you have, Natalie's a really good person to contact.
The only other piece I was going to add about inclusion, it has to do with early childhood. We've had a big increase in children with disabilities entering the system at 3 and 4 years old. And obviously with regard to we want the same inclusion opportunities to exist for those children as well. So there was an expansion of the Fifield program that actually merged with the Lee Academy Pilot School. And through advocacy and working with those schools directly, we were able to get the commitment to have more inclusive classrooms in that program itself, and that there is going to be a substantive review of all of the children's IEPs that are currently in substantially separate programs at the Fifield from now to the beginning of next year, to ensure that all children that can be in inclusion have the opportunity to be in that type of setting. The other thing that we advocated for and were able to accomplish is that there was a long-standing policy actually dating back to 1997 in BPS that the early childhood programs, the EECs and the ELCs, did not allow more than 4 children with disabilities in any one of the classrooms, and that's actually less than the law requires. So we advocated for and got the school committee to change that policy so that the maximum number of children with disabilities by regulation, and that depends on the particular class size, but it can be generally up to 7 or 8 children, that they would be allowed to participate in those programs on the go forward. So it's really a matter of opening up more opportunities across the districts and in all types of programs. So if you do know parents who have children in the earlier ages that are looking for inclusion opportunities, please let them know that these additional opportunities now exist, and we'll obviously try to get the word out as well.
A question here and then one over here also.
So I came in a little late, so I apologize if you covered this at the beginning, but you're given the uncertainty of sort of everything that's happening in Washington right now. You know, how secure is the budget for things, some of the stuff that you spoke on earlier about like additional teacher training, you know, additional paraprofessionals in classrooms, stuff like that? Is that something we need to worry about, or is it?
Well, we always have to worry about our funding. I've been in public education for about 30 years, and in no one of those years did we have enough money to do the things we need to do. We have an excellent chief financial officer in the Boston Public Schools who knows more about managing the finances of a large urban district than anybody else that I know. He has planfully prepared our budgeting process for the sequester and for things that will follow that. He's informed us that we are expecting there will be a cutback as a result of what's going to happen tomorrow. However, he already built in a buffer for next year's budget to absorb most of that cutback. I spend part of every day now working with his office on utilizing the funding we have available this year for many of the things that would sort of taking available funds we have this year and investing them in a way that'll give us a benefit next year. So we can't really roll most of that money forward, but we can spend it now in a way that will benefit us next year, like professional development, assistive technology, building alterations, etc. It is also true that we have expanded spending in special education by a huge amount of money in the last 2 years. And in that process, we have done work that thank you. So from this current year to next year, the expected spending was going to increase by 86%. We have cut that back to about 60%, but it's a 60% increase in spending from this year to next year. And the reason it's going to cost a lot more money next year is we have expanded early childhood special education by exponentially, by hundreds of children. And we've expanded all of our ABA services likewise. So we are expecting to spend about $8 million on ABA services alone starting in September. And so his name is John McDonough, and what John has guided me and my colleagues in my office is to figure out ways to be really wise about what we're spending our money on now and in the future, and more efficient ways to do it. And an example of that is that while we developed what's called a hybrid model to delivering ABA services, where we have contracts with outside providers, and we have a growing number of our own employees who are very highly skilled in providing ABA services. We have found out over the last year that contracting it out, outsourcing that, is a lot more expensive than doing it ourselves.
Well, I think, yeah, but in fairness, I mean, I think it's an issue too of that we have a large number of students in BPS that require ABA services, and that ABA services are something that, because there's such a higher demand for them, not only across the state, but across the country and, you know, internationally as well, that it's been hard to get, you know, enough people to service the amount of children that we have. So what we did is, while we're working on building our internal resources, is that some of that work had to be contracted out to professionalized agencies who also had to hire people to meet our needs. But obviously it's better and much more cost efficient in the long term to have that be an internal workforce, but the ability to hire and retain those people has been an ongoing challenge for a number of years. So that's why John brought in, to get us out of the compliance issue with ABA and to bring us up to date on all of the evaluations, and to have all of the children who are supposed to be receiving those services get those services, is to have them serviced in both ways, through both internal resources and external resources, because what we know is historically BPS did not have adequate internal resources, and there were many children before John came on that were not getting their services as required under their IEP. So some of the expense, you know, rightfully so, had to deal with some of the backlog of services, but now on the go forward, we have more children that have come in that also require those services. So it's a huge expenditure under the special education budget, but it's not one that's discretionary. These are services for children and they're specific type and they need them, but it becomes an issue for us as a district, and both as the parents working with the district for the benefit of all of our children, and the district as a whole, is to figure out, you know, the effective ways of doing that in the most cost-effective way possible without diminishing the meaningfulness of those services, because what we know is it's going to be a long-term cost, and no matter how much we can say the law requires it, you have to do it, at the end of the day there's only so many dollars in that bucket that can be spread around. So we need to figure out how to prioritize things, how to come up with different models that can serve different kids in different ways, and be really creative about doing that. And that's sort of what the whole process has been, is to get into compliance and now try to work on doing it in more cost-efficient ways.
One thing to add to your question on the federal side of the equation, the district is adding for their overall budget about 1,200 special ed kids next year. So that's a very, very significant increase. So that's partially why the numbers have increased to that level. But on the federal side of the equation, what's also considered to be a logical point is that we may have a short-term reduction where we're looking at a stopgap logic to address it. But then there's also a logic that feels that there will be a retroactive, the monies will come back. But we are trying to plan that there is a true decrease. How will we try to function with it? But it appears that there might be some wiggle room with that.
And proposed reductions to, it's not proposed reductions to the existing budget, it's proposed reductions to what was proposed as the next budget, but those are not coming out of direct services to children. Those are coming out of other areas so that the services to children remain, you know, stabilized.
There's a question over here and then here.
Yeah, I have a question on the actual creation of the inclusion classrooms with respect to certification of teachers. If you need to create classrooms with teachers who are special education certified in order to have a particular inclusion classroom to serve many kids for a variety of disabilities, and you're coming to a school with teachers who don't have that certification, but there's no room in the building to create another class, how does that work out? Or is this just something when teachers retire that the new hires are going to be certified, or is there going to be teacher training for certification? how's, practically speaking, does that kind of work?
Well, you just mentioned a few of the mechanisms.
Okay.
We are able, under our collective bargaining agreement, to set the requirements for jobs. So in classrooms that are inclusive classrooms, we can determine what the staffing should be and then what the qualifications of those staff will be. Now, you do make a valid point, and that is that when we are in a given school converting classes from segregated general education classes to inclusive classes, there are people teaching in those classrooms who may or may not be qualified or skilled. And so we can make some changes up to a point, and then we have to figure out other ways of doing it. And one way of doing it, as you mentioned, is provide the certification programs, arrange the certification. The training is the important thing. The qualification is the certification. So we're working on that right now.
Yeah, and I would say that, you know, as we move forward in developing this strategic plan by June, you know, we're just the parent volunteer representatives that are participating in that. We're open to listening to what other people want us to bring up at these meetings, what people think works, what people think doesn't work. Because, I mean, John and I actually do both have experiences with having our children go to inclusion, but we also want to hear from what other people's experiences are, because, you know, we have specific experiences and you have other experiences, and we're representing everybody as a group. There's 10,000 parents and guardians of children with special needs in the Boston Public Schools, and, you know, we're only, you know, but a dozen, the entire executive board of parent volunteers. So we obviously want the input of other parents, and that's sort of why these meetings are too, is to give you information, but also to get your input and to give you the opportunity to give us information, whether it's tonight at the meeting on, you know, in writing, whether it's you send us an email, whether you call our voicemail. All those opportunities exist for you to give us your thoughts and your ideas so we can include those in the conversations. I certainly would never claim to understand everybody's perspective and everybody's ideas, and this is an opportunity for sharing that. So some of it tonight was to bring to you what we've learned from working with BPS over the last year, and a lot of it has to do with the inclusion, but also to say we have some solid commitments right now to improve things, and this is the proposal on moving forward. And, you know, if you have thoughts and ideas on how that should happen and where that should happen, I don't know the 130 schools in BPS. You know, I wouldn't have the time to travel around to all of them, but you guys do. So what's working in your school, or what do you need in your area, and where is there a need for inclusion where there isn't any currently? Because that's part of the overall perspective is what do we have and what do we need, where do we have it and where do we need it? I don't myself know, you know, I have some ideas, but I certainly don't have the answers to all of those questions, and we would, you know, ask for that input, not just welcome it, but request it,
we need your input, so.
There's a question here and then back to it.
When you were just touching on the budget, a question, was there money allocated for transitional services?
Yeah, so in two ways. One is we have funded and are in the process right now of recruiting a transition supervisor. So that money is in this year's budget and in next year's budget. We have money which we have received from the state for professional development. So we have between $200,000 and $300,000 this year for professional development. We expect to have the same amount next year. And there's a group of funding opportunities coming up in April, which we would be able to invest in the other kinds of things we have to do in transition, like contracts with partners and changing the staffing to some extent at the school level, et cetera. So we're estimating that the investment this year will be in the range of about $350,000 that we have right now, and the investment next year will approach $500,000. And that money is one of the items that is protected in the budget for next year.
Real quick point. On the flyer on the website, on the main page, is what's called Indicator 8 Survey. It's a survey to allow parents to give feedback to BPS. It's a critical survey. On there is a list of what schools are available to take the survey. Not every school can be a part of it. So if your school's a part of it, please answer the survey as truthful as you can, because that feedback is critical to how things are working.
Yeah, the survey actually goes to the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. So it's feedback to special education that gets reported to the state. And obviously parental input is critical for that type of a survey. And I know that currently there's been only a small percentage of parents that have participated. So if your school is on that list, please participate, and please let other parents know about it as well. We've definitely sent it out by email and we've put it on the website, but obviously the best communicators are other parents. So please help us in that effort.
It's good till I think mid-March or end of March, but we'll send another reminder out. It'll be on our materials again, the main page, the link's there. It's an online survey available in I think 10 to 15 different languages as well. So the option there, you just obviously have to have a computer. That's the only caveat. Right there.
Oh, I thought you had a
Nancy?
question.
I just had a quick question. You had said that, if, and just mentioning that if there were early childhood people that we knew that wanted opportunities. So does that mean that this fixes the problem of the EI kids coming out that had the backlog that didn't have seats?
There's no backlog.
There's no
It's been
backlog,
resolved.
and it's all resolved. Okay.
So Boston Latin School was set up a long time ago as an exam school. As a result of being an exam school, it is not true that 18% of all the children at Boston Latin are students with disabilities. Now, I happen to take some issue, just as an educator, with the idea of having exam schools. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is children with disabilities have to have access to all of the programs that we offer in the Boston Public Schools. And my department is right now beginning an initiative to ensure that advanced work classes across the city at all grade levels are accessible to children with disabilities who qualify for those classes. Kids with disabilities historically in Boston and in many other cities have been categorically excluded from advanced work classes. We're going to change that.
But children with disabilities also can't bypass sort of a standard that's established and applied equally to everyone. So like for the exam schools, there's children that go to Boston Latin that have IEPs, but they got in through the regular process of the exam. So they got there the same way as their other peers got in there. But the same thing with like a vocational school like Madison Park. Vocational schools, you basically go through a lottery process. So there's children with disabilities that go to Madison Park. In fact, there's a high percentage of kids, I think it's in the 20s, of kids with IEPs that already go to Madison Park. The difference is that an IEP team can't say, we're going to assign, Mary to Madison Park because we think that's an appropriate placement for her, because the placement process doesn't get to go around the existing process that applies to everyone equally.
I'll tell you that some students with disabilities who pass the exam to get into AWC in the past were not allowed in AWC. We're changing that. So that's to Carolyn's point, that if a youngster with disabilities
Yeah, you don't get in because of your disabilities, but you also don't get excluded because of your disabilities. In fact, if you get excluded because of your disabilities, that's a civil rights issue.
Right. So we're trying to address that now. Jerry and then Ken.
Just to follow that, once you're in there, the school culture has to provide you with the accommodations that will enable you to succeed. Just passing an exam doesn't mean that you're going to be able to succeed in the class day after day. The culture doesn't allow that. So in some ways, the exam school is an extreme test case of what needs to happen across the city of all schools to make sure that the school culture and the regular ed culture provides the accommodations and the support that kids need to be successful. It's just harder to do an example as good as that particular culture.
I agree. I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, the culture needs to be changed throughout
So,
the district.
so on the AWC issue, we're spending as much time on the culture of AWC as we are on the process that kids get in with. A question over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, the schools that you're proposing or thinking about for full inclusion in the fall, are they going to be new schools that are open, or are they going to be existing schools that you're converting to inclusion, and have you decided that yet?
Well, I know it's the latter because we're not opening two brand new schools, right? So
that
they
means
have
that
not been identified yet. This is, I mean, the External Advisory Committee, this was part of working on the SpEd overlay, because I was trying to obviously use the change in the assignment process to move forward our priorities, which is to get more inclusion. So basically, this ELL has the proposal for 3 more dual language programs, and I said, well, we want something concrete for special education. And that's when they said, well, we'll do 2 full inclusion schools, but that conversation has not gone on because the commitment was just last week. Right. So that's why this, now there's a committee set up to work on the inclusion strategic plan, and obviously one of the first orders of business needs to be, if we're designating 2 schools as full inclusion in September, where are they and what supports and changes need to occur in order for that to be successful in September?
Because the gentleman said back there, it's just a culture thing. You can't just...
Right, there are definitely some schools that have already been changing their culture and have been doing more inclusive opportunities. And I wouldn't be surprised if a school that's already partway there becomes one that's the full inclusion, as opposed to starting with a school from scratch. But, you know, that's not, we're the parent volunteers. We can make recommendations on what we want, but we certainly have not chosen which schools those are. But obviously, if parents have ideas on which schools should become or needed in their neighborhood, then we will, you know, pass along that input as well, so.
You can add to that. We'll talk about the 2 schools right now, but there's also going to be a plan going forward on rolling out the expansion, so it's not as slow as it was prior. So this is the first tangible thing, 2 schools right away. And then we're going to work on a plan 3 to 5 years on how they're going to roll this out.
And do you think it's going to be something that, like, you know, if it's a K-5 school that's identified, is it going to be across the board, all the K-throughs, like 5 classrooms become inclusion, or start?
Well,
like,
the commitment that I asked for and actually was able to get as part of the assignment process was what I historically have known to be full inclusion schools, meaning every class at every grade level has children with disabilities. So, I mean, that's the commitment I got. It's not for me to implement it, but that's the commitment that was provided.
We still have a lot of work, obviously.
So if anyone else wants to volunteer, we're welcoming of people. That's it for tonight. Thank you.
Please.
Go ahead. Okay.
Yes, I wanted to say, the full inclusion, I hope this means that a child in this inclusion class or specially inclusive class means they'll be learning everything like the other children in the class there. Because what I'm saying
if it's appropriate for them, or if they need it to be modified in any way, it gets modified for them.
Yes, because what I'm saying is this, because with my 18-year-old child, we didn't have this. Right now, he did go to full inclusion class. He's 18, and he could have done better if he was really challenged to his appropriate level. So he's left now.
But inclusion needs is getting your individual needs met while also being educated with your typical peers.
That's wonderful. That way, both socially and otherwise, they can do better, because right now when they remain in that special ed class, they just interact with themselves. There's no change or anything. So I hope this means that right now they can interact with other children that don't have the disability, and they can see how other
Well, that's what we're working to increase throughout the district.
That's very wonderful. That's wonderful. And again, I filled out the form, and all my needs that I put out there, people did contact me and everything, and we're following up. Thank you very much.
Good. That's great. Go ahead.
Hi, I just want to say I think you're doing an amazing job.
Oh, thank you.
That you're doing. And the question I have is, on the checklist, you have social students, placement versus assigned. Can you just touch upon that for a minute?
Well, for children who are currently assigned, the question is for children in partial inclusion and resource room kids. So for the assignment process itself, we know that by law, the IEP team determines the type of placement and generally the location of the placement. But the superintendent didn't want to limit parents' choices to, you know, having the special education office identify, and they wanted to give them, because generally, they try to give you 3 options if possible, but they'll give you the options and then you can go and look at them. The parents are allowed to participate in the typical lottery process if their child is in a partial inclusion with the thought that the services are brought to the child, that the child doesn't have to go to a different program, or they remain in their then current program. But the parent doesn't have to accept what's assigned to them through the lottery process if they don't feel that it's an appropriate placement. They can reject that, and then the Office of Special Education will provide them with additional placement options that are the type of placement their child teams decided that they need. Does that make sense? They wanted to give you more options?
No, you totally, I got my answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's more of a suggestion just to her comments about changing the culture in the schools and how in every school you might feel the environment might not be the best for your child, but if you actually talk to the principal as a parent to have or bring up ideas of how to make more inclusion in the classrooms, I think some of them actually, I talked to mine personally.
And I think it depends on the principal. I would agree that a lot of principals have been embracing inclusion and been promoting inclusion and doing it on their own and sort of doing it in ways that they can do it. And what we're trying to do is obviously do it in a much more comprehensive way by having the discussions with the schools, but also they're allowing us as parent volunteers to participate in that so that we can bring the parent perspective from the table. And, you know, we're supposed to be a whole team approach, so we're trying to do it in a team-based way. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.